The memo was dated April 13, 1953, marked top secret, and authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles with clinical bureaucratic language that disguised its revolutionary purpose. Project MKUltra will investigate whether and how it is possible to modify an individual's behavior by covert means. The newly created program would receive unlimited funding, operate outside normal oversight, answer only to the CIA director, and pursue research so unethical that its existence would be denied for 2 decades and its full scope would remain classified even after public exposure. Over the next 20 years, MKUltra would dose thousands of unwitting Americans with LSD and other hallucinogens, test chemical and biological weapons on prisoners and mental patients, develop torture techniques later used in interrogations, collaborate with Nazi scientists recruited after World War II, fund university research into brainwashing and mind control, operate dozens of front companies and institutions as cover for experiments, and destroy most of its records when exposure became imminent, leaving only fragmentary evidence of a program that treated American citizens as expendable test subjects in the Cold War race to weaponize human consciousness. This is the story of MKUltra, the CIA's mind control research program that began as response to fears that communist nations had developed techniques to control human behavior and ended as one of intelligence community's most profound ethical catastrophes. It's about the scientists who designed experiments that would be rejected by any ethical review board, who saw human subjects as research materials rather than people with rights, who rationalized torture and psychological destruction as necessary for national security. About Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist who directed MKUltra and personally oversaw experiments involving LSD administration to unwitting subjects, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, verbal and sexual abuse, and chemical interrogation techniques. About the institutions that collaborated, prestigious universities like Stanford and Cornell, hospitals and prisons that provided vulnerable subjects, pharmaceutical companies that supplied experimental drugs, all operating under cover of legitimate research while actually serving CIA's quest to break and control the human mind. About the victims who were dosed with hallucinogens without their knowledge or consent, who developed permanent psychological damage, who committed suicide during or after experiments, who spent decades not knowing why they'd experienced psychotic breaks or personality changes until MKUltra's exposure finally provided explanation decades too late. About the 1975 Church Committee investigations that revealed fragments of the program after whistleblowers and journalists forced acknowledgement, leading to official apologies and compensation for some victims but never full accountability because 90% of MKUltra documents had been destroyed on orders from CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973. And about the legacy that persists in ongoing distrust of government assurances, in conspiracy theories that mix genuine evidence with speculation, in the knowledge that for 20 years the CIA conducted Nazi-level experiments on American citizens and the only consequence was that they had to stop and say they were sorry. The program's origins were rooted in Cold War paranoia about communist mind control capabilities, fears that were partly justified and partly projection of America's own interest in developing such capabilities. The trigger was the Korean War when American POWs appeared in propaganda films denouncing capitalism and praising communism, statements that seemed too coordinated to be voluntary and suggested sophisticated brainwashing techniques that the US didn't understand. CIA analysts, already concerned about reports of Soviet experiments with drugs and hypnosis, concluded that communist nations had achieved breakthroughs in behavior modification that gave them strategic advantage. The logic was simple and terrifying. If the Soviets could control human behavior reliably, they could turn American soldiers into unwitting agents, could extract classified information regardless of subjects' willingness to resist, could undermine democracy itself by manipulating leaders and populations. The US needed to develop equivalent or superior capabilities, both to defend against communist techniques and to employ them offensively. This defensive framing, "we're only researching this to protect against enemy use," became standard justification for experiments that had obvious offensive applications and that were pursued with enthusiasm that suggested national security was pretext rather than actual motivation. The program's structure was designed for deniability and secrecy, operating through front organizations and cutouts that distanced CIA from the actual experiments. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, ostensibly a private research foundation, was actually CIA front that funneled money to university researchers who often didn't know their funding came from intelligence sources. Hospitals and prisons received grants for research projects that were described as studying mental illness or rehabilitation but were actually testing interrogation drugs and behavior modification techniques. Private psychiatric practices received patients who were actually CIA subjects being monitored for long-term effects of experimental treatments. This compartmentalization meant individual researchers could claim ignorance about the broader program, universities could claim they thought they were conducting legitimate research, and the CIA could deny direct involvement if experiments were exposed. The funding mechanisms were deliberately opaque, money moved through multiple accounts, false invoicing disguised research expenditures as other activities, and documentation was minimal to prevent paper trail that could expose the operation. The LSD experiments became MKUltra's most notorious component, representing both the program's ambitions to alter consciousness and its complete disregard for subjects' rights or welfare. The CIA became interested in LSD's potential as interrogation tool after research suggested it could break down psychological defenses and make subjects suggestible or unable to maintain cover stories. Initial experiments involved giving LSD to volunteers, typically CIA employees, in controlled settings to observe effects. But the program quickly expanded to dosing unwitting subjects, rationalized as necessary to study the drug's effects when subjects didn't know they'd been drugged and couldn't prepare psychologically for the experience. Operation Midnight Climax involved CIA safe houses in San Francisco and New York where prostitutes would lure men back to apartments fitted with one-way mirrors, dose their drinks with LSD, and CIA operatives would observe the subject's behavior for hours. The operation served multiple purposes: testing LSD's effects on unwitting subjects, developing delivery methods that wouldn't be detected, and blackmail operations where compromising footage could be used to recruit assets. The subjects had no idea they were in CIA experiment, experienced terrifying hallucinations without understanding why, sometimes suffered permanent psychological damage from single exposure to high doses of LSD administered in threatening environment. The university research funded by MKUltra included experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics but which were conducted by respected institutions under cover of legitimate research. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute received CIA funding for experiments involving depatterning, using electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and drug-induced comas to erase patients' existing memories and personalities, theoretically allowing them to be rebuilt from scratch. Patients who'd come to the institute seeking treatment for depression or anxiety were subjected to weeks of experimental procedures without informed consent, waking from induced comas unable to recognize family members or remember basic biographical information. Some never recovered, spent rest of their lives institutionalized or dependent on family care, their personalities permanently destroyed by experiments disguised as psychiatric treatment. The justification was that understanding how to break the mind completely would reveal how to control it, that the techniques being developed could be used on enemy agents or to treat mental illness, rationalization that ignored the reality that test subjects were being destroyed without their knowledge or consent for research of questionable scientific validity. The recruitment of Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip provided MKUltra with expertise in human experimentation that had been developed in concentration camps, expertise that American intelligence valued more than accountability for war crimes. Kurt Blome, who'd conducted biological warfare research for Nazi Germany including experiments on concentration camp prisoners, was recruited by the US and contributed to MKUltra's biological and chemical weapons research. His knowledge of how various toxins affected humans had been obtained through lethal experiments on people who had no choice and no chance of survival, research that would have led to execution if prosecuted at Nuremberg but instead led to American employment because his expertise was deemed valuable. The moral compromise was explicit. Nazi war criminals received immunity and comfortable lives in exchange for sharing their knowledge, and the US government decided that strategic advantage outweighed justice for the victims whose suffering had produced that knowledge. This collaboration normalized the idea that human rights could be suspended for important enough research, that ends could justify means regardless of how horrific those means were, creating ethical framework that enabled MKUltra's domestic experiments. The prison experiments targeted populations that were legally vulnerable and had minimal ability to refuse participation or report abuse, making them ideal subjects for research that couldn't survive ethical scrutiny. Federal prisons in Atlanta and Lexington received MKUltra funding for experiments involving LSD, morphine, and other drugs administered to inmates who were told participation would earn them reduced sentences or better conditions. The consent obtained was meaningless given the coercive environment. Prisoners understood that refusing participation might result in retaliation, that cooperation was rewarded and resistance punished, that they had no meaningful choice regardless of what consent forms they signed. The experiments included deliberately addicting prisoners to morphine to study addiction and withdrawal, testing LSD's effects on subjects already under psychological stress of incarceration, and using prisoners as guinea pigs for drugs that were too dangerous or untested to give to any population that could refuse or seek legal recourse. The research produced data about drug effects but also about how to exploit vulnerable populations, how to obtain compliance through mixture of reward and threat, techniques that had obvious applications in interrogation and control of detained subjects. The mental hospital experiments exploited patients who were already institutionalized and whose mental illness made them unlikely to be believed if they reported abuse, creating population of perfect experimental subjects who could be used and discarded without accountability. Dr. Harris Isbell at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, conducted experiments where mentally ill patients and drug addicts were given LSD continuously for weeks at doses far exceeding what any ethical protocol would allow. Some subjects receiving the drug for 77 consecutive days to study whether tolerance developed and what psychological effects resulted from sustained hallucinogenic state. The subjects experienced psychotic breaks, developed permanent psychological damage, and in some cases died from the experiments or committed suicide during or shortly after, deaths that were attributed to their underlying conditions rather than the experimental protocols that had pushed them beyond human limits. The researchers maintained detailed records of subjects' deterioration but showed no evidence of concern for their welfare, treating human suffering as data points in research that was supposed to reveal how to break enemy agents but actually revealed how easily medical professionals could abandon ethics when authority structures provided permission and when subjects were dehumanized through categorization as mentally ill, criminal, or otherwise socially expendable. The development of torture techniques that would later be employed in CIA interrogations represented MKUltra's transition from pure research into operational application, the point where experiments became tools for breaking prisoners regardless of whether they actually produced reliable intelligence. The research into sensory deprivation involved isolating subjects in dark, soundproof rooms for days or weeks, documenting how quickly psychological breakdown occurred when deprived of environmental stimuli. The findings showed that most subjects hallucinated within hours, became disoriented and suggestible within days, and experienced lasting psychological damage if deprivation continued beyond a week. This knowledge was incorporated into interrogation manuals that recommended using isolation to break subjects before questioning, creating psychological vulnerability that made resistance difficult. The research into self-inflicted pain involved making subjects stand in stress positions, maintain uncomfortable postures for extended periods, documenting how long they could endure before begging to stop. The findings informed interrogation techniques that didn't leave visible marks but caused extreme suffering, allowing interrogators to torture while maintaining deniability about their methods. The destruction of records in 1973 was deliberate strategy to prevent accountability when exposure seemed imminent, representing calculation that destroying evidence of crimes was preferable to facing consequences for having committed them. Richard Helms, CIA director, ordered the destruction of MKUltra documents as he was leaving office, knowing that congressional investigations were likely and that the program's exposure would create scandal. The destruction was systematic, entire filing cabinets of documents were shredded, operational files were burned. Researchers who'd worked on the program were instructed to destroy their personal notes and records. The goal was to eliminate evidence that could support criminal prosecutions or civil lawsuits, to prevent Congress from discovering the full scope of experiments, to ensure that victims could never definitively prove what had been done to them. The strategy partially succeeded. When the Church Committee investigated in 1975, they found only fragmentary evidence, approximately 20,000 documents that had survived because they'd been misfiled in budget records rather than operational files. These surviving documents revealed enough to confirm the basic outlines of MKUltra but not enough to provide complete accounting of all experiments, all victims, all collaborating institutions. The destruction of evidence meant that perpetrators could claim ignorance or deny specific allegations, that victims couldn't prove their experiences, that the full truth would never be known. The Church Committee hearings in 1975 represented first public acknowledgement of MKUltra and created political pressure for reform, though the limitations of evidence meant accountability was minimal. Senator Frank Church, leading the investigation, stated, "The CIA's program was a massive, systematic search for new and better ways to control human behavior. It used universities, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and prisons. It used American citizens as guinea pigs. It used techniques we associate with totalitarian states." The hearings revealed specific victims including Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist who'd been given LSD without his knowledge during a 1953 retreat and who fell to his death from a hotel window 9 days later in what was officially ruled suicide but which his family believed was either murder to silence him or direct result of the psychological trauma from being unknowingly drugged. The testimony documented experiments that shocked the public and Congress, created demands for reform and accountability, led to executive orders prohibiting human experimentation without informed consent and creating oversight mechanisms for intelligence operations. But criminal prosecutions were deemed impossible due to destroyed evidence and expired statutes of limitations. Civil lawsuits were settled out of court with minimal compensation, and the individuals who designed and conducted the experiments faced no criminal penalties, many retiring with full pensions and some continuing to consult for government programs. The victims who were identified and compensated represented tiny fraction of those actually harmed, the small number who could prove they'd been subjects despite the destroyed records and the decades that had passed since their experiences. The 1996 class action settlement provided approximately $100,000 to each of 77 identified victims, compensation that was simultaneously substantial and grossly inadequate given the permanent psychological damage many had sustained. But thousands of other victims could never prove their participation because records were destroyed, because their experiences occurred at institutions that denied involvement, because the effects of single-dose LSD administration decades earlier couldn't be definitively distinguished from other causes of psychological trauma. These uncompensated victims carried their damage silently, some dying never knowing they'd been CIA guinea pigs, others suspecting but unable to prove, all abandoned by the system that had used them. The identified victims' stories revealed the human cost. People who'd never been the same after hospitalization for minor issues, who'd developed schizophrenia or other mental illnesses during or after treatment that they later learned was experimental, who'd lost careers and marriages and normal functioning because CIA experiments had broken their minds while testing techniques to break enemy agents. The legacy in intelligence community practices revealed that MKUltra's exposure didn't end in ethical experimentation but rather made it more carefully hidden and better disguised with legal cover. The techniques developed through MKUltra appeared in CIA interrogation manuals used in Latin America during the 1980s, in the torture protocols employed at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo after 2001, suggesting the research had been deemed valuable enough to preserve and apply despite its discredited origins. The legal memos authorizing enhanced interrogation techniques during the War on Terror drew on research traditions established by MKUltra, the same logic that physical and psychological torture could be calibrated to break resistance without crossing legally defined boundaries, the same assumption that national security threats justified methods that would be criminal in other contexts. The exposure of these programs created new scandals and new promises of reform, but the pattern repeated: initial shock, limited accountability, procedural changes that addressed specific abuses while preserving institutional capacity to conduct similar operations under different names and better oversight. The conspiracy theories that emerged in MKUltra's wake mixed genuine evidence with speculation in ways that made it difficult to separate confirmed facts from paranoid extrapolation, creating an environment where legitimate suspicion of government was indistinguishable from baseless conspiracy mongering. The confirmed facts, that CIA had dosed unwitting citizens with LSD, collaborated with Nazi scientists, destroyed evidence of crimes, faced no meaningful punishment, created reasonable basis for believing other allegations about government experimentation and cover-ups. But the confirmed facts were then mixed with unproven claims about continuing mind control programs, about celebrities and politicians being brainwashed subjects, about mass shootings being conducted by CIA-controlled assassins, speculation that used MKUltra's existence as evidence that anything was possible if the government wanted it. This conflation served intelligence community's interests by making critics seem unreasonable, by creating a situation where genuine evidence-based concerns about government abuse were dismissed alongside paranoid fantasies, by muddying the historical record so thoroughly that separating truth from fiction required extensive research that most people wouldn't conduct. The academic and medical communities that had participated in MKUltra faced minimal professional consequences, with universities acknowledging past involvement but claiming they'd been deceived about funding sources and true purposes of research. McGill University eventually apologized to victims of Dr. Cameron's experiments but maintained that Cameron had acted without university knowledge, that the institution bore no responsibility for approving research protocols that violated basic ethics, that current oversight systems prevented similar abuses. This institutional deflection of responsibility allowed collaborating institutions to claim they were victims of CIA deception rather than willing participants in unethical research, to avoid financial liability and reputational damage that full accountability would have required. The individual researchers who'd conducted experiments were protected by their institutions, by statutes of limitations that prevented prosecution, by professional associations that were reluctant to retrospectively punish members for research that had been conducted under government auspices, even if that research was now recognized as horrifically unethical. The international implications included accusations of American hypocrisy when criticizing human rights abuses by other nations, given that U.S. had conducted experiments that violated the Nuremberg Code principles established to prevent repetition of Nazi medical atrocities. Soviet propaganda effectively used MK Ultra revelations to counter American criticism of communist human rights records, pointing out that while U.S. condemned Soviet psychiatric abuse of dissidents, CIA had been conducting equally abusive experiments on its own citizens. The exposure damaged American moral authority and created cynicism about whether democracies were actually more ethical than totalitarian states or simply better at hiding their crimes. The revelation that similar mind control research had been conducted by British, Canadian, and other allied intelligence services suggested that MK Ultra wasn't isolated American aberration but part of broader Western intelligence community's shared investment in developing psychological warfare and behavior control capabilities regardless of ethical constraints. The scientific validity of MK Ultra research has been questioned by researchers examining whether the experiments actually produced useful knowledge or whether they were pseudoscience disguised as legitimate research. The mind control techniques that were supposed to be developed never materialize. Decades of research failed to produce reliable methods for controlling behavior or extracting information that were superior to conventional interrogation. The LSD experiments generated data but not applicable techniques. Subjects' responses were too variable and unpredictable for operational use. The drug's effects couldn't be controlled precisely enough to serve interrogation purposes. The sensory deprivation and torture research confirmed that these methods could break people psychologically but also confirmed they produced unreliable information as subjects would say anything to stop the suffering. The brainwashing research never achieved the goal of reliably implanting false memories or altering personality permanently. From scientific perspective, MK Ultra was expensive failure that destroyed lives without producing the promised capabilities, raising question of whether the research was actually about advancing knowledge or whether it was about indulging curiosity and exercising power over vulnerable subjects under pretext of national security. The ethical frameworks developed in response to MK Ultra's exposure include regulations requiring informed consent for human subjects research, institutional review boards to evaluate research ethics before approval, special protections for vulnerable populations including prisoners and mentally ill, and restrictions on classified research involving human subjects. These reforms were necessary and valuable but also revealed that ethical guidelines only work when institutions are willing to enforce them, that oversight can be circumvented by determined researchers, that national security classifications can be used to hide unethical research from review boards. The regulations prevented most overt abuses but couldn't prevent more sophisticated evasions where research was conducted overseas or through contractors or with subjects who were technically volunteers but whose consent was obtained through coercion or deception. The fundamental problem, that intelligence agencies believe they need capabilities that can only be developed through unethical experimentation, wasn't resolved by new oversight systems but simply forced agencies to be more creative about how they pursued such research while maintaining deniability. The comparison to Nazi medical experiments highlights both similarities and differences that reveal how democracies can commit atrocities while maintaining illusion of moral superiority. The Nazi experiments were conducted in totalitarian system with explicit ideology treating certain populations as subhuman and legitimate targets for experimentation, with no pretense of consent or ethical consideration, with perpetrators who faced trial and execution at Nuremberg. The MK Ultra experiments were conducted in democratic system with implicit rather than explicit dehumanization of subjects, with pretenses of national security necessity and occasional consent that was coerced or uninformed, with perpetrators who faced no criminal consequences and often continued working in research or intelligence. The differences suggest that democracies' crimes are more insidious because they're hidden better and rationalized more carefully, that oversight systems can be corrupted or circumvented by claiming national security exceptions, that the rule of law applies selectively when powerful institutions decide they're exempt. The similarities suggest that human capacity for institutionalized cruelty isn't limited to totalitarian states, that ordinary professionals will commit atrocities when authority structures provide permission and when victims are successfully dehumanized, that the specific political system matters less than the ethical culture and accountability mechanisms that do or don't constrain those with power. The families of victims who died during or because of MK Ultra experiments carry intergenerational trauma that includes not just grief but anger at betrayal by institutions that should have protected their relatives. The Olsen family spent decades demanding investigation into Frank Olsen's death, eventually receiving acknowledgement and apology from President Ford but never receiving full explanation of what had happened or why. Eric Olson, Frank's son, devoted his life to investigating his father's death, uncovering evidence suggesting murder rather than suicide but never obtaining definitive proof that could support prosecution. The families of patients destroyed by Dr. Cameron's experiments faced similar frustration, knowing their relatives had been harmed but unable to hold specific individuals accountable because the evidence had been destroyed and the perpetrators were protected by institutional immunity. This intergenerational harm represents MKUltra's ongoing legacy, the way crimes committed in the 1950s to 70s continue affecting families today, the knowledge that justice was denied and will never be achieved because too much time has passed and too many perpetrators have died. The government's official position on MKUltra has evolved from complete denial to limited acknowledgement to selective apology, with each phase carefully calibrated to provide minimum transparency required to satisfy political pressure while preserving maximum institutional secrecy and deniability. The 1975 acknowledgement admitted the program existed but minimized its scope and impact, portrayed it as regrettable Cold War excess rather than systematic violation of human rights, emphasized that it had been terminated and reforms implemented. The 1995 apology under President Clinton acknowledged harm to victims and promised compensation but avoided detailed accounting of all experiments and all collaborating institutions, maintained classification of most remaining documents, refused to declassify information that might enable additional victims to prove their claims. The current official position is that MKUltra was historical aberration that violated principles intelligence community now upholds, that modern oversight prevents similar abuses, that full disclosure isn't possible due to legitimate national security concerns and privacy protection for subjects who weren't identified publicly. This position satisfies few observers because it requires accepting assurances from institutions that demonstrably lied for decades and destroyed evidence to avoid accountability. 70 years after MKUltra began and 50 years after its public exposure, the program represents permanent evidence that democratic governments will conduct Nazi-level experiments on their own citizens when they believe national security requires it and when they can maintain secrecy long enough to avoid accountability. The victims who can be identified number in the hundreds, the true total likely numbers in the thousands, and some effects cascade to tens of thousands when including family members and communities affected by victims' psychological destruction. The perpetrators faced no criminal prosecution, many continued working in intelligence and research, some are buried with honors and positive obituaries that don't mention their participation in human experimentation. The institutions that enabled MKUltra, universities, hospitals, prisons, pharmaceutical companies, acknowledged past involvement but avoided meaningful accountability, maintaining that they were deceived by CIA about true nature of research despite evidence suggesting they knew or should have known what they were facilitating. The oversight reforms implemented after exposure have prevented most overt abuses but haven't eliminated classified research on human subjects, haven't stopped intelligence community from developing interrogation and psychological warfare techniques through methods that push or exceed ethical boundaries, haven't prevented outsourcing of unethical research to countries with fewer regulations and less oversight. MKUltra's lesson isn't that democratic institutions learned from their crimes and reformed themselves, but rather that they learned to hide their crimes better, to create legal frameworks that provide cover for activities that remain fundamentally unethical, to sacrifice individuals when exposure occurs while preserving institutional capacity to continue similar operations under different names. The destroyed records mean full truth will never be known, the victims who were never identified will never receive acknowledgement or compensation, the techniques developed through torture and experimentation continue being used despite their discredited origins, and the assurances that it could never happen again come from the same institutions that said it wasn't happening while it was actually occurring. That's MKUltra's real legacy, not the specific experiments or specific victims, but the knowledge that government will abuse citizens when it believes it can avoid consequences, that national security will be invoked to justify atrocities, that oversight systems only work when those being overseen want them to work, and that justice for victims of institutional crimes requires smoking gun evidence that institutions will systematically destroy to protect themselves.